Spoiler warning ahead for the video. There are spoilers, so be careful. If you want to go watch it quickly and then come back, I would recommend doing so. The Brawn GP documentary just came out a few days ago on Wednesday the 15th of November, and I have already watched it. Now, I'm going to give my honest review about the documentary, going through every episode and just saying exactly what I think about the new documentary. Now, this episode primarily focused on the start of Brawn and the end of Honda. So there was a lot of the 2009-2008 financial crisis, a lot about that. There was a lot about the development of the car. There was actually only a singular race shown in this episode, which I think was fantastic, because to really understand why the Brawn GP story was so insane, you have to start much earlier than the first race. Now, of course, we were led through this documentary by the one and only Keanu Reeves. It was quite funny seeing him interview all of these massive names within F1, and I wonder how much time he spent getting ready for this, because obviously I don't know much about Keanu Reeves. I don't know if he actually is an F1 fan, but if he isn't, props to him, because he made it look like he knew what he was talking about. Episode 1 started off talking about Ross Brawn, you know, giving a brief history about his career, obviously the Ferrari days, moving to Honda, and the start of Brawn. And because this episode was focused on the end of Honda and the new Brawn GP, obviously it's named after Ross Brawn. Ross Brawn and Nick Fry were the two big boys in this episode, which I think is really good, because obviously Ross Brawn everyone knows, but Nick Fry does not get as much credit as he should get in the making of Brawn GP, because obviously it's named after Ross Brawn. But after they talked about the financial problems Honda had, having to shut down, no one really wanted to buy the team as well. Obviously, Ross Brawn infamously bought the team for £1. And I think that was shown perfectly in this documentary, because it really showed just how rushed everything was. They bought the team with 6 weeks left until the first race. And because they had to wait so long to buy the team, obviously that meant finding an engine supplier within 6 weeks as well, which they dive into. And to be fair, they do go into depth with how much the other F1 teams did help Brawn, but it was between Ferrari and Mercedes. Imagine Brawn put a Ferrari engine. I don't think it would have gone as well, because they even say in the documentary, if you have a Ferrari engine, you will not be beating Ferrari. Now, they also talked in this episode about the double diffuser, because obviously that was a massive talking point in the new regs. And I think they did this perfectly, because you don't have to know a lot about the sport or a lot about how aerodynamics work. They just briefly explain to you what a double diffuser is, how it works and why it works. And they just explained it really well. Now, towards the end of this episode, they start talking about the testing. Now, Brawn were actually late to the testing, of course, because they were in such a rush to get that car together, and the pressure and the way they did this in the documentary just really pushed how fast they had to get everything done, and it was quite intense, which I really did enjoy. It can make you feel like you don't know if they're going to get it done in time, but obviously they get to testing and they see all the numbers, and it shows that they are blistering quick. And then they go into depth talking about how none of the team principals, or no one really in F1, even with the fast laps in testing, really believed Brawn did have that pace, because they needed sponsors, and they go into that in the documentary. Very good with how they just they were going everywhere to try and find sponsors for this car, because they just had no money. Then we get to the Australian Grand Prix, which they really showed well. What I really did like is how they explained qualifying and how the race works, because they literally did it in like 10-20 seconds. It explained what all of this meant, so anyone who's not watched F1 before and just wanted to hear about the Brawn story. And then to finish off the first episode, I really like how they showed how when the team was struggling for like money and everything, all the teams were backing Brawn, but as soon as they literally came out of Australia with that 1-2 showing how much pace they had, all of the teams literally went, they have an illegal car, and instantly turned their backs on them, which was hilarious. But obviously it happens to this day in F1. You've seen Mercedes do it with Red Bull. You've seen Red Bull do it with Mercedes. So we know this still does happen in F1. So that was episode 1, and I really think it was a good way to start this series, because they really slowly pushed you into it. They kind of explained the sport a little bit for anyone who doesn't really understand it. They also really went into depth about Ross Brawn, not really about Nick Fry, but they do obviously have him in the documentary talking about a lot of stuff. And I just really like how they brought in stuff outside of F1 and outside of the racing, because the Brawn GP story is all about everything that happened outside of the racing. Yes, the racing was where they got their championship, but outside's where the talking gets done, and so much happened this year. So I would say that episode 1 was my second favourite of all 4 episodes. Now episode 2 is where it really gets into the season. We have a few new storylines picking up throughout this documentary, and this episode really focused on, again, how much Brawn was struggling with staff and funding. They had to go all the way to France, have a whole meeting with the FIA and all the teams to see if the double diffuser was legal. And this is where FOTA gets picked up as a storyline. So in 2009, basically all the teams wanted to do a breakaway series because they weren't getting enough money from F1. And episode 2 very much talks a lot about all of this process. Now, I also think the pacing of how they went from each race to each race was amazing. So they actually went through Malaysia, China, Bahrain, Spain, Monaco, and Turkey all in one episode. This is where the on-track drama really starts to happen, because the Barrichello storyline comes up with him getting annoyed with the team because he thinks that they're favouring Button over him, and that storyline is great. They also talked a lot about how Brawn started off the season well, but slowly every race after every race you could see other cars picking up the pace, putting on double diffusers, whatnot. And I think the documentary does a great job showing just how much pressure was being applied to Brawn, because they knew they had no money to add upgrades. They were trying to find sponsors everywhere, and other teams were catching, and fast. But like I said, I'll move back to the FOTA storyline, which I think was done so well, because funnily enough, everyone sees Brawn as this fairy tale story, but it wasn't that smooth sailing like they show in the documentary. By the way, the cinematography in this documentary I think was brilliant. They also knew what technology to use at the time, because obviously they had to do quite a few shots with like Brawn and Fry, and obviously they can't just be pulling out iPhone 10s. It's just small things like that where they pull out an older iPhone, which I just liked, because, you know, it shows they put in the time to think about these little things. Brawn, literally, they said in the documentary they signed a deal with the devil, which was Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley. They really focus in on that and how Brawn were sort of blackmailed into signing this agreement to get more money into F1 that they actually deserved. It was their money, but Bernie was holding off because he wanted to disrupt FOTA from making that breakaway series, which we end off episode 2 thinking that he's done it. And I understand why they sort of end on like a cliffhanger, but at the same time, all of the episodes were released at the same time. It's a bit of a weird series to have cliffhangers on, but that wasn't too bad. But I would say that was my third favourite episode. I really enjoyed everything that came up, but I do also think that quite a lot of stuff happened outside of the Brawn story in this episode, which I'm happy for them to show, but that's probably why I'd put it third place. Now, moving into episode 3, the FOTA storyline finishes. That's one of the main focal points again, and basically I think the way they showed it was brilliant, but I won't give too many spoilers, so watch episode 3 if you want to see how that ends. But I think they did a really good job showing just how much Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley sort of were kind of pricks. But yeah, that storyline I think was great, because there were so many twists and turns throughout it. So really enjoyed that, and it's a storyline that you wouldn't really know unless you were a part of Brawn or remembered news from all the way back from 2009. So I'm really happy they added this to the documentary, because it adds so much depth to the Brawn GP story, and it's a part of it that not many people would have known about. Now, this episode also focused on Silverstone quite a bit, because this is the point of the story where Brawn loses its momentum. Button has a really bad race and doesn't really get up and start going again throughout the season. And Red Bull beat them, and it really shows this is the part of the season where everyone starts overtaking Brawn. Now, also in this episode, we get a lot of backstory on Barrichello, which I thought was nice, but I think they should have added a bit more on the Barrichello storyline, because we didn't really get that much of a background on him. And now, obviously, I know quite a bit about Barrichello. I've actually made a video on him. But I would have liked to have seen a little bit more about him and his journey to that 2009 season. But yeah, after the FOTA storyline ended, that was what basically this whole episode was about. They really focused down on how Barrichello was rising in form and Button just was completely declining in form. And they also talked about the Massa incident with the spring coming out of Barrichello's car, and obviously how it affected Barrichello because they are both Brazilian, and he sort of felt like he should be the one helping Massa, and knowing that it was his car's fault for doing what it did to Massa, and it was a bad injury, it really shook him. But that was another storyline they did really well, because then they show in the next race how Barrichello won, and it really shows how like he did it for him, and it, in sort of a way, that was the momentum Barrichello needed. He was doing this for Massa, he got his first race win of the season, and it really pushed him, which we saw going into episode 4. Now, it's really hard ranking these episodes, because I would put this episode last, but by no means is this a bad episode. I will say I'm very biased, because I think this is the episode that focused the least on Button, and I am a Button fanboy, so that's probably why. But this episode was fantastic, so even though I'm giving this the last place on the episode list, this just shows how good this documentary was, because even this episode was fantastic. Now, this episode really focused again on other teams catching up to Brawn, Barrichello's rising form, Jenson Button still not doing well enough even though he's in the championship lead, and because it was the final episode, a considerable amount of it was the Brazilian Grand Prix, which was obviously the race where Jenson Button won his title. Now, again, this was the episode where Jenson Button sort of gets a background on him. Again, I think like Barrichello, they should have done a bit more than what they did. I liked how they had a good bit of background on John Button, which was Jenson Button's dad. I liked how they also had Lewis Hamilton's dad come in for an interview, which was quite nice. That's another thing about this whole documentary. The amount of interviews they got from drivers, team principals, team chairmen, I thought it was brilliant because it was so well planned. It must have taken forever, and I really enjoyed seeing so many big faces in F1. They also got like engineers. It was really just good to see. And the way they wrapped it up in Brazil, I was a bit upset. I'll talk about this in the problems I had with the documentary, but they didn't really talk about Abu Dhabi, and I know it's because the championship ended, but I would have quite liked to have seen it like a 1 or 2 minute extra showing Abu Dhabi. But if you've been following along, you will know that this was my favourite episode. I think purely because it was the final episode, you know, you got to see all the celebrations, and I think it just did a great job rounding off everything in the documentary, and that's why it was my favourite episode. But that is everything that happened in the documentary and what I think about it. Now, of course, I'm always going to be a little biased because Jenson Button will and always will be my all-time favourite driver. He was a driver I grew up on. He was he is still my favourite driver technically. Favourite all-time F1 driver. Obviously, I'm still a McLaren fan from him because he stayed with them for 7 seasons. So basically, once he retired, I just stuck with McLaren because I didn't really know what else to do. But I really think this was such an amazing story. Now, before I end this video, I actually do want to talk about the bad things of the documentary because I want to give my review out of 5 stars, and I will give it. But basically, one problem was they didn't get Sebastian Vettel. Now, obviously, Rubens Barrichello was Jenson Button's main title contender for most of the season. However, Vettel came second that season. And there were mentions of him because Christian Horner was there and Mark Webber. But I would have liked for Vettel to get interviewed. Maybe he said no to it. I don't really know what the situation is about that. But quite disappointed to not see Sebastian Vettel because they could have made it a lot more intense talking to Vettel as well, because he well and truly could have won the title that season as well. Or I also think they should have brought up more just a bit how not lucky but sort of lucky as well Brawn were. Because in the 2009 season, they talk about how the cars were outperforming Brawn by the end of the season. But they don't really talk about why they got kind of lucky. And it's because Red Bull, one race, will be first and second. Then the next race, Raikkonen will go win it. And the Force Indias will be second with Fisichella in it. That did happen in Spa. And then you'll then go back to another race and the McLarens are fucking the best car on the grid. So I really do think they skipped out on quite a bit of storylines where they could have, yes, it was about Brawn, but they could have really explained just how lucky they were that the best team at every track was so different that season. Now, like I've already said, I think Barrichello's background should have been a bit longer and Jenson Button's background should have been a bit longer. And the last really con of the whole documentary I have is I think it deserved one extra episode. And it's for the reasons I just gave. I think if you added Vettel interviews, I think even if you got Hamilton and Raikkonen in it, because they also won races that season, and obviously I know it's about Brawn, but it does affect the Brawn story with how McLaren was so bad and then also got a bit better. And I would have just really enjoyed hearing their opinions on the Brawn GP story and how they felt when their car was feeling better. Like, did they think they could push Brawn? Because they didn't really say it in the documentary, and it would have been interesting to hear their thoughts on the second half of the season where they really started to pick up the pace. I also think with the added backstories and Abu Dhabi being involved, I think they could have made 5 episodes with it, because there were some points where it did feel like it was a bit rushed. But overall, I would give this documentary 4 out of 5 stars. It's a great watch. I'd recommend it to everyone who likes F1 and who doesn't like F1, because it's such a great fairy tale story with a team no one thought could win the championship, a driver no one thought, let alone could get a win rather than a championship. Everyone said he didn't have that championship mentality. By the way, when I say that, I mean before Button got his win in his Honda days, people would say that they didn't think he was going to get a win. And with the second half of the season Brawn had, being basically beaten out on pace most of the time by a few other cars. And with the way F1 is going, I don't think we'll ever get a story like this again. But anyway, thank you for listening to my review. Highly recommend going to watch the Brawn GP documentary on Disney+, and I'll see you all later for another video. Bye bye.